My name is Milton Feinstein. I live in New York City in the United States, and and in particular, I live in Riverdale in the Bronx. My background is having been raised in the United States. I lived during the time of World War II. At that time, at the point of graduation, or just prior to graduation, some military people came to the high school to inspire us to enlist so that we may pick the branch of service, which I, as well as many other of my classmates, did. And I enlisted in the then Army Air Force. And I was inducted into the service in a very short time in April of 1944. There, after induction and basic training, I became ultimately a radar technician regarding high altitude bombing. By the time I finished my training, the war had ended. World War II had ended in Europe, and I was prepared to go to the South Pacific, to Okinawa, as a matter of fact, to form a new air base. In any case, that bombing group was disbanded when the war in the Pacific ended as well. At which point I returned to the East Coast from California, where I had been stationed, and sent to Europe for about 6 months of time, finally discharged. So when this opportunity to travel with Rabbi Bar Chaim for his program for the Haredi people who might be interested in joining the IDF, I certainly was interested in making that trip with him and my nephew, two of my nephews, just to see how the Army bases there. And of course, I didn't expect to see much. Of course, being a stranger, I expected that the soldiers, by their very nature, would be there to guard and protect and avoid any kind of direct contact with people. But I was completely mistaken. And seeing and meeting with Rabbi Bar Chaim, the relationship between the soldiers and the rabbi was so personal and so intense, it amazed me. And as a consequence, we, visiting with Rabbi Bar Chaim, were treated equally friendly and equally at ease with each of the soldiers who we met there. The beautiful people. They were more than friendly. Here they were doing their duty. We were at the bases where they did their guard duty, their guard work, and having traveled from one base to another, we wound up at the nearest base I could tell to Ramallah. At which point, as we were standing there observing, listening, talking to other soldiers, I heard rifle fire going off in Ramallah, and I turned to one of the soldiers and I asked about that. What's going on? He said there's probably a wedding and they're firing rifles into the air, and it seems to me fascinating that these bullets were going vertically. However, if they turned and were fired horizontally, we would have been having a lot of trouble in a lot of ways. So my admiration for these Haredi, and it was interesting that having heard about the Haredi, many of whom avoided military service, but because of Rabbi Bar Chaim's program, they were attracted to serve, do duty, and continue their Torah studies as well. And so I was completely impressed with the relationship of these Haredi soldiers with their religiosity, with their continued interest in religion, and their service to Israel. Altogether, it was an impressive trip. And I particularly admired Rabbi Bar Chaim for his accomplishment. From what I understand, it was an idea that developed from him, by him, some 20 years ago, and 19 years ago it was implemented with, I think he told me, 32 original inductees. At this time now, he said there were about 2,000, and it seems to me he has a very personal relationship with every one of them. Very impressive. I thoroughly enjoyed the trip and the meeting and the concept altogether.
Okay, thanks. Do you have an example, a story that you see the relationship between the rabbis and the soldiers? What amazed you?
Well, as the rabbi, as we exited the car and as the rabbi approached even those soldiers that were nearby, he was warmly greeted. The soldiers themselves embraced him. He embraced them. At one particular point where I was in conversation with one of the soldiers who had told me he was a medic, a little later the rabbi came by and asked the soldier if he still planned to become a doctor in his field. That was very crucial to me. That was so important that he not only knew them by name, but he knew their interests, what was going to happen with them in the future after service. And I can only think that he has indelibly remembered every one of these people, every one of his relationships with these people, these young men, these lovely young people, for their interests, their future, and their hopes. And to me, that was very clearly shown by both the rabbi and the reaction and responses of the soldiers themselves. Nesach Yehuda
Why do you think it's important?
is a follow-up program to service in the IDF that the rabbi has initiated, and it follows these young people for their future, for future connection to study, to Torah, to continued service, although not in the military, which I think is very, very important, not only for themselves, but for the country at large. So I applaud Rabbi for his efforts to continue or follow up with the program in this way for these young people.